This time we look at 5 classic 250 trail bikes from the 1970s. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. The 250, for many it is the perfect capacity. Enough power to keep you interested, but light and nimble enough to make sure that the bikes are still quite manageable. But in the 70s, off-road bikes developed the look which we would instantly recognise today as a trail bike. So here are 5 of the very best. Harley-Davidson SX 250. There's really no motorcycle more American than Harley-Davidson. Well, except the SX of course. It was built by Aermacchi in Italy, who Harley-Davidson brought out in the 1960s. The SX used a 242cc piston-ported, air-cooled two-stroke engine built by Aermacchi in Italy. The engine kicked out around 20 horsepower, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but was pretty much on the money in the early and mid-70s. Early models used drum brakes all round, which of course were fairly average. Later models had a front disc, at least on the roadster versions. The SX, however, the more off-road version, used drums throughout. It also had a 21-inch front wheel and an 18-inch back, so fairly typical for a trail bike. Not for the first, or indeed the last time, Harley-Davidson was trying to appeal to a younger market, and of course, not for the first or last time, it didn't prove successful. The bike was nicely styled, but on the road, although it looks nice and American, it really didn't feel American. It felt like exactly what it was, a two-stroke Italian small capacity motorcycle. But of course that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you forgive the somewhat feeble brakes, the engine performed well enough, the styling was pretty good, the bike was light and nimble, and so made a great fun road bike. But not unsurprisingly, the bike didn't attract a great number of traditional Harley owners. But it wasn't really targeted at those people anyway. But the problem was it didn't really attract that many young riders either, and the bike only sold in fairly modest numbers. Today there are a few of these bikes still kicking around, so it is possible to buy one. The thing is, Harley-Davidson, with their parent company AMF really struggling at that point, desperately needed a success, and it didn't get one. In the end they sold the factory off to the Castiglione brothers, who then later marketed the bikes as Cagivas, a mark of course with its own off-road heritage. Ultimately of course the American-Italian experiment wasn't a successful one, but if you're looking for an off-road bike from the 1970s, it's a really cheap way to buy a Harley-Davidson, and a fairly cheap way to buy an off-road bike too, if you can find one in good condition. There are still a few around, if you look really closely. The Yamaha DT250. Yamaha's DT250 is one of the more successful two-stroke trail bikes of its day, been in production from 1971 right through until 1982. The engine was an air-cooled 246cc single-cylinder two-stroke with reed valve induction. The engine was a development of those used originally for pure off-road machines, but horsepower varied greatly between markets. In some countries it only made 17 horsepower, in others 24. This power was then fed through a 5-speed gearbox. Now while the figures don't seem exactly earth-shattering, this is of course a fairly lightweight machine, so it makes best possible use of the power that's available. And contrary to popular belief, an appropriately tuned two-stroke can be an extremely torquey beast indeed, making the bike far more usable and indeed user-friendly than you would imagine. Over the number of years of the bike's production, the styling was gradually changed, from the more curvaceous 1970s and the more angular styling of the late 70s and early 80s. The engine remained the same, but was gradually detuned to meet American emission regulations. In the early 80s, Yamaha adopted a single shock system at the rear. This was of course an evolution of that design for motocross, but an updated suspension and chassis couldn't hide the fact that the engine was somewhat outdated, and in the mid-80s it was replaced by a water-cooled motor. But the old air-cooled bike remains to this day a popular, user-friendly two-stroke trail bike. Suzuki TS250. The TS range was a whole family of two-stroke trail bikes, developed and used by Suzuki during the 1970s, but in fact they first appeared as early as 1969, in the form of a 185. The large 250 arrived later the same year. It wasn't actually a great deal more powerful than the 185, and it was 28 kilos heavier to boot, but of course mid-range punch from the larger engine was much improved. Unlike the smaller engines, all the larger capacity TS's used piston-ported induction. Early models pre-1973 made do with a 4-speed gearbox. This was upgraded to 5 speeds from 1973 onwards. In the US the bike was known as the Savage, and in Japan the Hustler, but in the UK it was simply called the TS250. It seems the British just don't like exciting names to their bikes, but whatever name you gave the thing, the Suzuki was an easy to use, highly versatile machine. The design of the bike was heavily influenced by Suzuki's motocross machines. It's often said that the motor is essentially a modified and detuned version of the Pucker Race TM engine. But looking back, it's hard to say how much of this was truth and how much was just advertising blurb. Although historically the engine is said to be derived from the earlier Villiers Star Maker from the early 60s, having identical bore and stroke and other design features too which resemble it. But while the road bike's stock 23 horsepower lags an awful long way behind the Pucker TM, a tuning kit was available which could elevate the power all the way to 31 horsepower, and even in stock form the bike was still capable of over 80 miles an hour on the street. All round the suspension setup is generally on the soft side. This means it makes it user friendly for inexperienced riders, but for more experienced riders it probably just gets rather bouncy. On road however, that soft suspension setup makes for a very comfortable ride, just not particularly sporty. Over the many years of its production run, Suzuki gave the bike a number of stylistic updates, although mechanically it was in fact very little changed. When compared to its main competitor the Yamaha DT, it was said that the TS was less refined, but the soft suspension setup and softly tuned engine meant the machine was much more user friendly, especially in the hands of novice riders, thus making it in many people's eyes one of the finest off-road machines of the 1970s. The Honda XL 250. Honda's XL 250 first appeared in 1972, and at the time was the first enduro bike to employ a 4-valve head. Although this was actually a fairly straightforward system, which used a single overhead cam and multiple rockers to operate the 4 valves. But even with the 4-valve head, the engine made around 24 horsepower, so it wasn't a great deal more powerful than any of the opposition with more conventional valve setups, although it must be said that mid-range torque was noticeably better. Now it's often said the Honda was the first production bike to have a 4-valve head. This is absolutely not the case, because Triumph's Ricardo model used 4-valve heads as early as the 1920s, with Roger their Ulster model following just a couple of years behind. And in competition form, the engine dates back all the way to 1911, an Indian's 8-valve racing V-twin. An interesting point is that the cams ran directly in the head, with no purpose-made bearing material, so neglected oil changes and you could often find the camshaft rattling away in there. So if you go to buy one of these machines, or the RS Road version, and the engine is rattling badly at the top end, it may be a good idea to walk away. But top end problems aside, was it not always so with Honda, the rest of the bike is extremely robust, and very simple too. There's drum brakes all round with cable operation, because let's face it, everybody likes a trail bike with tailable brakes, don't they? A fairly simple gearbox and engine setup means that the whole device is very robust and very reliable, and is designed to take a punishment and just keep coming back for more. One of the curious quirks of the design is that for some reason, known only to Honda, they decided to fit a 23-inch front wheel to the thing, everybody else of course using 21 or smaller. This does mean that finding good rubber can be rather tricky, although thankfully for tyre makers and indeed riders everywhere, the unusual size wheel was dumped after 1981. Also in 1982, as well as that 21-inch more conventional front wheel, Honda would introduce a proper 12-volt electrical system, as well as a monoshock system to the rear suspension, called the ProLink. But in whatever form you find it, the XL is an archetypal trail bike. It's simple, it's robust and it's reliable. But while the XL did remain popular for many years, time did eventually catch up with the design, and in 1987 Honda produced their last XL250. The Kawasaki KL250. After years of fire-breathing two-stroke designs, Kawasaki finally bit the bullet in 1978 and introduced their KL250. This used a single overhead cam engine, which was merely an enlarged version of that used on the KZ200 commuter bike. Simpler and lighter than most of its four-stroke competitors, such as Honda's XL250, the bike was more nimble and easier to use off-road. On-road, however, the bike does lack power compared to the XL, so the Honda is definitely faster, but the Kawasaki the better mud plugger. And indeed the KL250 did set the pattern which Kawasaki would follow for the rest of its four-stroke on-roaders, right up to the later KLRs and the KLR 650, which very much sets this pattern, although in a larger of course and much more powerful form, but it retains the same virtues: simple, reliable and rugged. Specifications of the bike are fairly straightforward. It's a 246cc single-cylinder four-stroke with a single overhead cam and just two valves in the head. The engine runs a fairly low compression 8.9 to 1, which hopefully makes starting the thing a bit easier, and peak power is only around 21 horsepower, and this is enough to push the bike along at around 74 miles an hour absolutely flat out. Although at that speed the bike is said to be rather buzzy. This is not the smoothest single available on the market. In keeping with most bikes intended for use on trails, there's a 21-inch front wheel and a 17 on the back. These are laced to drum brakes front and rear, so as always with these machines, braking is fairly modest. But riding a reasonable sized bike on a loose surface with no rider aids, maybe that isn't such a bad thing. And although they may fade if they really push them, drum brakes are at least consistent. They don't suddenly disappear from view whenever it starts to rain. Now I've no doubt there'll be those that are confused and annoyed in equal measure that I've not included one of Kawasaki's two-strokes instead at this juncture, after all lighter and more powerful. But what the KL represents is the dawning of the future. This bike set a pattern that Kawasaki would follow for decades to come, and we still see it today in the KLR 650. What other collections would you like to see on video? Or what machines would you like to see us do a single piece on? Or maybe you've got a bike that you'd like to see on video. Drop us a line in the comments below. I do hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.